during the intro, but I think it would be great to get started. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to the Lane Lyceum. It is something that we've been doing for the last, well, it's been going on many, many years, and it has a focus on talking about topics that matter and that are important to people. And this certainly qualifies to be one of those topics. And I think that we all have a desire to learn more and more about what's going on in Ukraine. And we're very lucky to have two wonderful speakers who are willing to share their backgrounds and give us some insight and understanding. So I will go ahead and introduce Jenna Crawford, who is the intern minister at First Parish in Needham, and she will start us off with a few words to set the tone for the evening. Okay, and welcome everybody.
Thank you so much, Amy.
You're welcome.
As Amy said, my name is Jenna Crawford. I'm the intern minister at First Parish in Needham, Unitarian Universalist, one of the co-sponsors of this evening's event. And we are a Unitarian Universalist congregation, and as such, we have a tradition of opening our worship services and meetings by lighting a chalice, which is the symbol of our UU faith. So this evening, we'll light our chalice with words by Euro-American UU minister, Reverend Jen Grayson. She writes, "Spirit of life and love, our hearts are aching today as we watch with fear and terror being inflicted on Ukraine. We pray from afar, seeing people flee in fear, praying in the streets, gripped by an uncertainty that echoes in our own hearts. We have known uncertainty and fear these last 2 years, and while we are aware it is nothing like war, we are reminded of our tie to the humanity of those we have never known. We pray for the parents trying to protect their children. We ache for children as forces outside their control shatter their world. We ache for those doing what they can to flee the movements of nations. And we pray for those who cannot flee. May the world not turn its face away from this pain, even in those moments when we as individuals must rest our spirits. May our thoughts and prayers become actions that end war and the threat of war forever. Amen." And before I turn it over to our wonderful presenters and moderator for the evening, I've been asked to say something really quickly about the spiritual dimensions of the evening. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, and other faith traditions have their own equivalents, we believe in both the inherent worth and dignity of all people, which is our first of 7 principles, and the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, our 7th UU principle. So we are called to act then whenever the dignity of one or many is being threatened, out of the understanding of our shared humanity, or the interdependent web, as we like to say. As Reverend Jen wrote, we have known uncertainty and fear these last 2 years, and while we are aware it is nothing like war, we are reminded of our tie to the humanity of those we have never known. So at this point, it is with gratitude and excitement that I turn it over to Smriti Rao, the professor of economics at Assumption University and affiliated scholar at the Women's Studies Institute at Brandeis University. She will be our moderator for the evening.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you for those really inspiring words that you read out. I want to welcome everybody. My name is Smriti Rao, as Jenna said, and I'm here expressly not as an expert on Russia or Ukraine or Europe. I'm an economist whose work focuses on India, so I'm here like everyone else is. I sense that the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion of their country is a geopolitical event of significance, that it will have a resonance and a long-term impact that may not even become clear until many years from now. And like you, I want to learn as much as I can about this, what seems like this very weighty historical event. And one does not say, historical weight that lightly, given that we're coming off a historic pandemic, which in turn came on the backs of a historic financial collapse. I mean, we clearly are not at the end of history. That is for sure. So I'm thrilled to be here with two Needhamites, Solari and Ilana Pavlotsky, who can help us with that kind of understanding. I want to offer my deepest gratitude to them for being here. And I want to thank the wonderful parishioners of the First Parish Needham UU Church, not just for organizing and supporting this series, this event, inviting me to participate, but for making such a difference in so many wonderful ways in the life of our town. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Ilana Pavlotsky and her brother David were born in Needham to parents from Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. Ilana will share her family's personal migration story and also tell us about the organization she is a co-founder of, which is called Boston Aide for Ukraine. Ilana has to leave at 8 p.m., so we're going to have her go first, and then we'll take questions that you might want to ask of her. I request everybody to put their questions in the chat, and we'll try to funnel them to her before she has to leave at 8 p.m. So without further ado, Ilana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. So once again, welcome everyone. I am so honored to be here. I want to make sure that you guys are seeing the right screen. Let me just make sure. There we go. Okay. So as was introduced, my name is Ilana Pavlotsky. I am 25 years old. I am a nurse, and I was born and raised in Needham, Massachusetts. As was mentioned, my parents are from Ukraine, which was formerly known as the former Soviet Union. So I am a first-generation American, and along with my brother and my brother's girlfriend, we have founded Boston Aide for Ukraine, hoping to provide a bridge from Boston to Ukraine. So a little bit about my parents' history, if I can. All right, so my parents' history, my mother, Rosalia, and my father, Leonid, were both born in what was known as the former Soviet Union. My mom was born in a small shtetl, like we like to called Korostin, right outside of the capital of Ukraine, Kiev. She grew up there with her family, with her sister, mother, and father. They grew up living in Kiev. She was a nurse back in Ukraine and was actually a nurse in the major city of Kiev that took in all of the firefighters after the Chernobyl nuclear explosion. So she was a victim of Chernobyl and speaks about it often with me. So I know firsthand the experience that she went through then, as well as her experiences walking through Babi Yar every day on her way to and from school. So just for you guys to kind of understand where she is coming from, her path to school was right through Babi Yar. She immigrated to Boston in 1988 with her parents and her little sister, and soon later met my father. My father, Leonid Pavlotsky, was born in what is now Bendera, Moldova. A quick little story, the same hospital that my father was born in, when he was born in it, it was in the county of Ukraine. My grandfather was born in the same exact hospital, but when he was born, it was Romania, and now it is Moldova. So now, as you guys can understand, these borders change very quickly. So in the span of 30 years, they changed once, and then in another 30 years, they changed again. And he, along with his grandmother, parents, and little sister, immigrated to Providence, Rhode Island in 1979. So a little history on my parents and how they came, or when they came to the States. Long story about their immigration, that's for a different section of history that we can talk about. But about me and my brother Daniel, as first-generation Americans, many ask us now, especially, why do I speak Russian if I'm Ukrainian? And many also ask, I thought you were Russian, because growing up, I often just said to people that I was Russian because it was easier than having to explain where on the map is Ukraine, or what is the former Soviet Union, or what is the USSR. These are types of things that many interactions that I would have on a day-to-day basis, people just would not understand what side of this world is. So it was just easier to say, I'm Russian. As you guys know, my parents grew up in the former Soviet Union, which was occupied all by Russia. And then everyone spoke Russian. It was taught in schools. It was expected to be spoken. And everyone to this day in all the surrounding countries still speak Russian. So a majority of those that live in Ukraine, their primary language is Russian, just simply because that is what for generations their families spoke. But I do understand Ukrainian, but I could not say that I speak it. So Russian is my first language. And the other question that a lot of people ask me is, am I Ukrainian or am I Jewish? Because along with me saying that I was Russian growing up, I would also oftentimes say that I'm Jewish. And this is something that I'm sure will be spoken about a little bit later on in this session. But in the former Soviet Union, of course, anti-Semitism was at the forefront at all times. And my parents' passports was actually stamped with their nationality as Jewish. In the Russian language, if you say that someone is Ukrainian, it is automatically implied that they are of the Orthodox descent. So it's very odd when I say to someone in Russian that I'm Ukrainian, because the understanding behind that is that I'm then Russian Orthodox. So that's why I specify when people ask me my nationality now, I am a Ukrainian Jew, because Jewish is still seen as a nationality in the area of what was then called the former Soviet Union. So I'm sure there'll be more talks about that later this evening, but just my personal experience of, am I Ukrainian or am I Jewish, or am I Ukrainian Jewish? Both of which I'm very proud of, but that comparison is often asked about, especially now. So to the left is a picture of my brothers and my father back in 2019 when we went to visit his hometown for the second time. We've been back and visited where he came from. This time in 2019, we actually surprised him. He was on a trip with my mother, and my brothers and I decided to surprise them by coming and visiting them. So the Benderia is the city that I mentioned my father is from, that is now part of Moldova, but back then was in Ukraine. And then to the right is the very famous Odessa National Academic Opera and Ballet House. Unfortunately, if you Google images of what this opera house now looks like, it is surrounded by bags of sand to protect from potential invasion. Thankfully, there has not been any attacks in this area right now, but they are to be expected. Odessa is a beautiful port city, full of life and music and jokes. It's known as the city of jokesters. So it's a beautiful city. And to show what this is not giving me a good time. This is a picture to the left of my father, my grandmother, and my father's uncle inside the theater. And my father said that this is probably back in 1972. As you can see, the interior is very beautiful. I would say it's probably the most beautiful theater in the world. And then you can see this is the picture to the right of when my family was there in 2019. So to transition a little bit more into Boston Aide for Ukraine and what our mission is and how this all started. About, I want to say 3 weeks ago now, days are blurring together. 3 weeks ago, there was a march in Boston for Ukraine, and my family had went, and we all felt that there was such an outpour of people that wanted to help and wanted to do something, but not necessarily knew how or which way to approach it. So my brother we looked at one another, and we kind of thought we could probably do something, whether it's 5 boxes of aid, 10 boxes of aid. We can probably put some things together and see where it goes. So along with my brother's girlfriend, Brianna, who has phenomenal experience in nonprofit organizations and fundraising, we have founded Boston Aide for Ukraine. Back in 2014, I was actually in Ukraine, in the northern area of Ukraine on a mission trip. Back when the whole war with Crimea started, I was on one of the last flights out, sent out by the embassy, the US embassy said, you have to go now. And back in 2014, I did a drive where we sent about 16 boxes to Ukraine. Each box weighed about 50 pounds. That was probably what our goal was for this go around. But we quickly saw that the donations were pouring in and the funds were just coming and going from left to right. So we realized that we really could make a huge impact and do something bigger. So we decided to take this on full force and see how far we can go with the assistance of our families and friends in Boston. So we are doing a mission a little bit differently. So there are many organizations like the Red Cross and things of that sort that are doing amazing work to help Ukrainian refugees, but our mission is a little bit different. As you can notice, Boston Aide is spelled as aid as a person is helping, not aid, A-I-D, but A-I-D-E. This is intentional. We are trying to connect to the people on the ground in Ukraine, on the borders of Ukraine and Poland and Romania. So what does that mean? I have worked very tirelessly to connect to those volunteers and to those people that live on those borders in Romania and in Poland. And today I actually received our first shipment of pictures. So the first shipment that we sent was already received at the Romanian border, and I got pictures with the refugees that have received the aid that we have sent. So our mission is to connect to those directly at the border and to send it from the people of Boston to the people of Romania and the people of Poland that are supporting the Ukrainian refugees. This way we can ensure that this help is getting to the ground and where it needs to go as quickly and efficiently as possible. So to date, we have sent almost 100 boxes of aid. And this is about 3,000 pounds of aid. This includes medication, clothes, food, hygiene products, toothbrushes, toothpaste, soap, many sorts of things we have sent over, as well as also partnering with other people that are flying to help the refugees. So in the top left, yesterday, actually, Emma came to my home. Emma is a young lady from Boston. She was born and raised in Romania until she was about 13 years old and reached out to us online earlier this week and said that she's flying out to Romania to support the volunteers there and the Ukrainian refugees, and if we had any connections that we could put her with. Not only did we connect her with the people on the ground that we knew, but we packed those 2 suitcases filled with aid for Emma to be able to fly out to. So she's actually currently on a flight to Romania as we speak. Her first stop is to a monastery right in Romania at the border of Ukraine. The monastery is housing pregnant women and women with young children. So as you can see, she is stocked up with diapers and goods for mothers that they would need as well. And to date, we have raised over $46,000 in funds through our GoFundMe and generous donations. And just for you folks to understand, each box for us to ship to Poland and Romania cost about $300. So as you can see in the bottom right, that is the first picture that we have received with our Romanian volunteers that have received their first round of boxes. So we have distributed boxes that we have shipped to different sites. So their site has currently received 3. Our first round of shipment was a little bit smaller. We had about 15 boxes go out. This next round, their site is going to be receiving 20 boxes of aid from us that we have shipped out yesterday. So before I go into questions, I'm sure people will be asking, how can they support Boston Aide for Ukraine? So we have a website where we have updates and information on our mission, bostonaideforukraine.com. We also have an Instagram and a Facebook account. And then the link for our GoFundMe is also located on our website for any of those that would like to donate and support. Unfortunately, we are currently not taking any physical donations because we've had an outpour of phenomenal donations sent to us, and we don't have the funds to be able to ship those goods as of right now. So we're pausing on accepting any physical donations, but we will be communicating through our sources, social media sources, as to when we will restart collecting physical donations to send out to Ukraine. So I will transition and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, please put your questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Ilana, for that. Maybe while we're waiting for people to ask, maybe I can get us started. This amazing work that you've been doing, trying to raise funds and supplies for Ukrainian refugees. And, you're pointing out there's been a real outpouring of support from folks in the greater Boston area. So let's imagine a really optimistic future in which Putin's forces withdraw, Ukraine's national sovereignty is restored. What do you think those of us here in the United States or in Europe, what should we be prepared to do over the medium or long term? What are some of the things that Ukraine might ask of us, once this immediate crisis has passed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a wonderful question. And that is something that my brother and sister-in-law are worried about. Unfortunately, as we see in media, things are kind of the hot topic for the week, and then they're no longer on the forefront of what we are watching and following. And I think that it's imperative for us to understand that even if the war were to stop today, they have to rebuild their whole nation, and our support is necessary throughout that whole process. And that support can be in various of ways. I already said to my parents that if this war stops, we have to go this summer and give them our business and visit and provide aid in that way, or continue to support. I mean, the surrounding countries in Europe have been phenomenal in opening their doors. And I mean, I have room here. I told my parents that my bed is open. So we just have to continue to support those throughout those months.
Thank you so much. I see one logistical sort of question, which is your organization a 501c3?
We are in the process of applying for one. We are a nonprofit, but we're in the process of applying for one. Thank you. Great question. We do have our lawyers working on that and hopefully expediting that process. This was something that came up and we did not expect it. So we absolutely understand that that is an important part. So we're working on that as we speak as well.
Yeah. Let's see, are there any other questions that people have or thoughts that anybody wants to share? I think somebody thanked you very much for sharing your presentation and your personal story. I don't see another question. So can I ask, let me see if there's one more. Jenna, okay, who thanks you for your witness and your advocacy. I have one more. Which is, as a sort of an immigrant myself, I'm really intrigued by the way you position all of the ands in your identity, right? You're Ukrainian and you're Jewish and you speak Russian. And I think this might be a theme that Chinzia also addresses. How do, from the perspective of your parents or those folks you meet in Ukraine, how do they understand their Ukrainian identity? Is it a similarly sort of complex combination of many things? What do you encounter when you go back to Ukraine and speak to Ukrainians about how they understand what it means to be Ukrainian?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the question would direct in the same way. So those Ukrainians, many fled the former Soviet Union. So many during the anti-Semitism, many Jews left, right? So those Jews that are still remaining probably would identify in the same way. But many of those that are there either converted from Judaism to Russian Orthodox to assimilate with the society, or are just kind of huddled together with their Jewish community. So there's still very prominent and strong Jewish communities there. But I would say that it's hard to say. It's a very closed, they're not exposed to the outside world, right? So they don't know any different. They don't see any different, probably similar to how your experience is with India. They're kind of in their world, right? And they don't see anything outside of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's been the most interesting things about Zelensky himself, right? Is his presentation of these multiple identities, which many of us living in the United States can identify with. I do see a couple of comments that I'm just going to read out. One is from Cynthia, who says, have you experienced any negative sentiments about your helping Ukraine?
So I want to say surprisingly, no. I feel like I have always had kind of negative things in my way in my life. That's what to be expected. But in this moment in history, I have never seen all people so united. And I mean all people of all backgrounds, all cultures, religions. It is beautiful to watch, and honestly, brings tears to my eyes oftentimes when I think about how many people are united that in typical days would most likely not be. I've had so many people reach out to me that I haven't spoken to in years, looking to support. So no, I haven't.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. There's a comment from Ellen who says, I very much relate to the mixed identities. When my family left Ukraine in 1910, 1915, we were Russian Jews. We would now be Ukrainian Jews. And maybe you've already said something, but maybe you want to elaborate. Can you comment more on this? And for example, how Zelensky identifies. And she adds, by the way, Jews, Slavs were considered a different race in the 19th and early 20th century. So I don't know if you want to add anything to what you already said.
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say that the Jewish culture, the Jewish religion has seen this side, the difficult side of anti-Semitism from the beginning of time. Zelensky actually is very much related to how my upbringing was. So his great-grandfather was a survivor of the Holocaust. Same with my grandparents. Sorry. He grew up in the same kind of home style that I did. Speaking the same languages. So as you can see, he speaks Russian fluently. Ukrainian was actually probably his second language. It's not something that's typically taught. It's taught as a second language. So oftentimes he's speaking in Russian because it just makes more sense. So I hope, does that answer the question?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. Anyone have any other questions or comments? I think we've covered most of them. And I know you have to leave, Ilana. It is 8 o'clock. So thank you so much for all your work. And thank you for speaking to us today. Very much appreciated.
Thank you all so much. And we so appreciate your support. It means a lot to all of us. So please continue supporting. Please, we understand that this is something that's been going on for a while, but the support for the Ukrainian people is what we have to give that to them. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So that was, I think, a really inspiring sort of witness. And so we turn to our expert on the region for tonight. It is a real pleasure to introduce Cinzia Solari, Associate Professor of Sociology at UMass Boston. I'm going to say a little bit about her book in a minute, which is fascinating. But I just want to say that Dr. Solari has published many articles that focus on the lives of post-Soviet peoples as they make their way in a capitalist world. And she lives in Needham with her family. Her daughter happens to go to Needham High in the same grade as my daughter. I just want to read out to you the description of her book, On the Shoulders of Grandmothers, Gender Migration in the Post-Soviet Nation and Post-Soviet Nation Building, which is a global ethnography that draws on 160 interviews with Ukrainian migrants and their families located in Italy, California, and Ukraine. And the description, when you kind of look at the book, it says the following: by comparing the experiences of individual migrants in two different migration patterns, Solari exposes the production of new gendered capitalist economies and nationalisms that precariously place Ukraine between Europe and Russia, with implications for the global world order. And of course, the book came out in 2018, but those last few lines are, of course, incredibly relevant to the moment we're in. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing her presentation. Dr. Solari, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm going to share my screen. And I'm so grateful to Ilana for sharing her family's personal story and the amazing work that she has been doing. So I am here as someone who has been studying this region for the past 20 years or so. And so I'll say just a few more things, even though that was such a lovely introduction from Smriti about my work. So I got my PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and I was trained in part at Berkeley's post-Soviet Center. And so my first book project was an ethnographic study of Ukrainian transnational nation-state building. And so an ethnographer is a social scientist who gathers data about the world by observing, interviewing, and participating in the social lives of people about whom you are curious. And the goal is usually to discover what the world looks like from the perspective of the folks you are studying and what the patterns and practices of meaning making might be. So for my book, On the Shoulders of Grandmothers, I learned that Italy was the largest receiving country in Europe of Ukrainian migrants, and California was the largest receiving state in the United States. So for my study then, I did interviews in Russian with Ukrainian migrants and community leaders in Rome, San Francisco, and then with children left behind in Lviv. And many of you are probably hearing about Lviv, Ukraine on the news because it is just 40 miles from the Polish border and is struggling right now to absorb the large numbers of internally displaced people looking to cross into Poland and other countries. So the migrants with whom I worked were mostly middle-aged women, grandmothers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, all with professional work histories as engineers, economists, and teachers. And they were now working, caring for the elderly in Italy or the US. And one of the interesting findings that I detail in the book is that these women thought of themselves as building the new Ukraine. These women had Soviet upbringings, and they were using their time as domestic workers, learning about what it meant to be European or capitalist, and they used those terms interchangeably so that they could then help their children learn how to gain honor, status, and economic security in a capitalist system, and to think about how one builds European institutions. So one day early in my fieldwork in Italy, I went to the Garbatella, and this is a large parking lot about an hour outside of Rome's city center, where courier vans that carted goods and workers between Ukraine and Italy congregated every Sunday. And a participant whom I call Tanya brought me, and we stood on a platform surveying the scene below. And she turned to me and said, "Do you see all those women down there? They carry Ukraine on their shoulders, and don't think they don't know it, and don't think they are happy about it either." Whoa. And I thought, wow. Women in my interviews talked about carrying Ukraine on their shoulders. And that is what inspired the title of this book. So, one of the narratives in our media is that we are surprised that Ukrainians are so tenaciously defending their country. And I can assure you that anyone who spoke with one of these Ukrainian grandmothers and heard their stories of resilience and determination to create a European Ukraine was not at all surprised. So one of our other dominant narratives of the war presented to us in the media is that no one had any idea that this war was coming, and Putin just lost his mind and invaded. Now, I have no inside information into Putin's state of mind. I have not interviewed him, but what concerns me about this individual level explanation of the current moment is that it obscures the larger social forces at play. Of course, Putin bears much of the responsibility for this war and for the horror of the war crimes that are happening right now. And we can also ask, what can we see if we place Putin and the Russian invasion of Ukraine in its larger sociological context? So I'd like to apply that perspective as I address some of the questions neighbors and friends and also undergraduate students have been asking me over these past few weeks, and see if we can't absorb a little bit more complexity. So I've organized my thoughts around common questions, and you'll see some overlap with Ilana. So the first question that folks ask is Ukraine part of Russia? And the answer is unequivocally no. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine, along with 14 other post-Soviet republics, including Russia, declared independence from the Soviet Union. And I think the reason why folks keep asking this is because, one, Russia and Ukraine have a complicated, intertwined history. And two, Western and Eastern Ukraine have had different historical experiences. So hopefully, without having all your eyes glaze over, I'm going to share in very broad strokes, given our time, a brief accounting of Ukrainian territorial history. So I'm going to take point 1 and 2 in turn. I'm not sure why my PowerPoint doesn't want to go forward. There we go. Okay, so I want to acknowledge that every statement about Ukrainian history is contested and political, even when speaking about ancient history. And here is an example. So Kievan Rus was the dominant power in Eastern Europe between 800 and 1200 AD. It covered most of modern day Western and Central Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Now, if you are a Ukrainian nationalist, then you likely understand Kievan Rus as an ancient Ukrainian state that was eons ahead of Russia in cultural development, as the image suggests. If you are taking history classes in Russia, then you might think of Rus as a unified people that are the ancestors of a single Russian people. So in this version, there are no Ukrainians. So this is not just an academic question about which version of history is true, but historians suggest that the equation of Rus and Russia as a universal, right, means that Russians, including Putin, might continue to find it difficult to engage with the political reality of an independent Ukrainian state. So all nations have origin myths, and the US does too. Every Thanksgiving, for example, we must grapple with that in some way. But historians will suggest that this flawed Russian origin myth is quite dangerous. And this is one of the legitimating narratives for the Russian invasion. So we hear Putin make statements like, modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia, and that Ukraine has no claims to independent statehood. So Putin has been saying that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I think the US and the West has not been listening. So,
Chinzia, could I just, someone pointed out that your screen is, your slides are not full screen. They're sort of in present, we can see, is it possible for you, is it not in presenter mode maybe? So they were just requesting whether your slide could be full screen. Yes, there we go, perfect, thank you, yeah.
See, it looked full screen to me, let's see.
Now it is, you're all set, yeah.
But it's not full screen for me this way. Sure. I'm going to get some tech support from my husband here.
No.
It's still showing in presenter view. That's odd.
Okay, and just do this.
I mean, if it doesn't, I mean, we could read it, just, you know, so no worries if it doesn't work. That's okay. We can go back to the way it was. There always has to be something.
I can show it like that. It's fine. I can show it like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm on to point 2, right? Okay, so one of the frustrations of Ukrainian nationalists is that Ukraine's Western and Eastern regions have different histories, and there are competing nationalisms in Ukraine. So Western Ukraine did not become part of the Soviet Union until 1936. Western Ukrainians had already cultivated a Ukrainian ethnic and national identity and managed to maintain the Ukrainian language, and they engaged in all kinds of resistance to maintain their language, and that included, in large part, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Clergy abroad that really did help preserve the Ukrainian language, mostly in exile in Europe. So the Soviet government found nationalist sentiment particularly dangerous to a political entity that's a federation, and they saw nationalism as possibly pulling the Soviet Union apart. So Ukrainian dissidents in the 1960s and 70s was the largest dissident movement in the Soviet Union, and 50% of all political prisoners during that time were Ukrainian. So Eastern and Southern Ukraine, however, have been part of the Russian Empire for 300 years, preceding the Soviet Union. So in the East, there was not a development of the Western Ukrainian style of nationalism in which we are Ukrainian because we share one ethnicity, one language, and one church. Although the majority of citizens in all regions of Ukraine, including the West, overwhelmingly voted for independence in 1991, Eastern Ukraine has historically felt culturally connected to Russia, favoring maintaining close political ties with Russia. whereas Western Ukraine has historically felt more cultural affinity with Europe and significantly less warm and fuzzy feelings towards Russia, who they are more likely to think of as colonizers. So Putin's idea that perhaps he would be welcomed with flowers when he invaded might not be totally out of left field. Now, had Putin consulted a Ukraine expert, they would have disabused him of this idea. But given the fraught history of national identity formation and the complicated relations between Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, it gives this idea more context. So again, Putin bears responsibility for the decision to invade a peaceful country. And we can also reach for a framework that draws our attention to this complex social history rather than dismisses it. So you might be wondering then, and Ilana spoke to this, is Ukrainian or Russian the language of Ukraine? And so the short answer is that since 2012, so that's pretty recently, Ukrainian is the official language of Ukraine. But like most things in this region, it's complicated. In Kyiv and Eastern Ukraine, you'll mostly hear Russian spoken on the streets. And in Western Ukraine, you'll mostly hear Ukrainian. And this has been changing with more Ukrainians claiming Ukrainian as their native language rather than Russian. But nationality politics are tied to language in this region. So linguists from outside the region will tell you that Ukrainian and Russian are two related but distinct languages. Russian nationalists might tell you that Ukrainian is just a dialect and a peasant language associated with uneducated and uncultured peoples. So when I was doing my research for my project, I was based in Lviv, and I spoke Russian, but not Ukrainian. And Ukrainians who considered themselves Ukrainian nationalists would look at me and say, I don't even remember my Russian anymore. And then after I, profusely apologized with my American accent in Russian for my university's lack of Ukrainian language classes, they would say, well, not even all Ukrainians speak Ukrainian, so I suppose we can't expect more from an American. And then they'd go on to speak flawless Russian, right? So Ukrainians who were native speakers of Russian, they might feel that they are no less Ukrainian for speaking Russian. And for many, Russian is connected to a larger cultural heritage and also just the politics of empire. So in Lviv, during my research, most TV and radio was in Russian. And the young adult children of migrants whom I interviewed told me that Russian was the language of social media and of business. So as you might be seeing in the news, even the transliteration of words in English is fraught, right? I'm sure you've seen Kyiv, K-Y-I-V versus Kyiv, K-I-E-V. And so, the Ukrainian transliteration is Kyiv, the first one, the Russian transliteration is the second. I use the first, but I am very aware that my graduate student recently from Kyiv, who's desperately trying to get her father out, spells it the second way. So I think, again, it's complicated. All right, so then in this case, what does the label Russian mean in our local US context? And Ilana mentioned this as well, right? So it's worth noting that the situation here in the US is different. In our US communities, we have folks that come from all over the former Soviet Union, and Russian is their common language. So for someone to refuse to speak Russian, it means cutting yourself off from what folks call the Russian-speaking community. And as many Ukrainian immigrants in San Francisco told me, and you heard it from Ilana as well, they often called themselves Russian to Americans because they said, Americans can't tell the difference, and we're all Russians to them. So in my book, I write about an interview with one woman from Odessa who I call Jenna. And Jenna was a native speaker of Russian. She didn't speak Ukrainian. She considered herself a Ukrainian patriot. And she was shocked to learn that when she moved to the US, Americans called her Russian. So she told me that she thought she was moving to the US to start the process of becoming of becoming American. And instead, she ended up becoming Russian. So that was a surprise for her. And I think in our US context, we take folks from lots of different countries like Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, and we call them all Asians in our context, or we take Mexicans, Latin Americans, South Americans, and we give them the pan-ethnic label of Latino. We do the same with folks from the former Soviet Union, and we label them Russian. So this means that our local businesses that might have Russian in the title, because they are either making themselves understandable to an American audience who 3 weeks ago might not have known where Ukraine was on the map, or they are naming a common cultural tradition, right? And so I saw that on our Needham Facebook page that there's, cafes with Russian in the title that are being boycotted. And I just want to say that doesn't really make any sense in our US context, because the founders, A, might not even be Russian, and B, even if the business owners were born in Russian, they have likely been creating a space that brings together people from all over the former Soviet Union because their livelihood depends on that. And they've probably also been using that space to help immigrants from across the region process this collective moment of pain. My child's third grade teacher here at Broadmeadow sent home an email last week asking parents to be careful about how we talk about the Russian-Ukrainian war, saying that she's been hearing third graders in her classroom talk about how all Russians are evil, right? So this, of course, is a good reminder to those of us who grew up with the Cold War to make sure that that language doesn't find its way into the mouths of our third graders and young people. Lots of families have one parent from Ukraine and one parent from Russia. So I just urge folks to be compassionate to all members of the post-Soviet community who might be positioned differently vis-a-vis this invasion, but are likely all experiencing pain in one form or another right now. Okay, so if Ukraine is not Russia, and I think Putin has done, in 3 weeks, more work in uniting Western and Eastern Ukraine, right, than democratic Ukraine was able to do since '91. But so then is Ukraine Europe? So there's a long history in the territory that we now call Ukraine for making claims to Europe. And I find it interesting that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been presented on this terrain of modernity and Europe as its set of ideals. So this was a central terrain of contestation for the participants in my book. And the promise of Europe for Ukrainians in my study meant economic stability, political accountability, personal freedoms, and a capitalist moral order. So I found that migrant grandmothers were transnational actors that were helping to build the new Ukraine from the outside in, but also from the bottom up. And this is what I mean. So Ina, like many migrants in Italy, was working hard to figure out what it meant to be a capitalist subject. And I think we don't usually think of that as an identity, but if you grew up in the former Soviet Union, then capitalist is an identity you're trying to wrap your head around. So Ina said, Cinzia, imagine that one day you wake up and everything you used to know about what you should do to be a good person, a successful person, has changed. How do you help your children? Ukraine will join Europe. Working here will help my sons learn what that means. So when I started this project, I thought I was going to write a book about the global care industry because I thought these women were migrating to do domestic work and send money back home. Now, while sending money back home was important, the women in my study thought that equally important was sending home understandings about how to make Ukraine Europe for their children. So participants like Ina studied Italian language. They observed Italian family life. They learned about Italian bureaucracy so that she could send ideas, ways of being, and understandings back to her sons in Ukraine about what it meant to be European and not Soviet. So Ina wanted to learn how one navigated capitalist institutions to gain honor and status, as well as economic stability for her kids. So I also conducted interviews with Ina's sons in Ukraine. Her oldest is a 28-year-old father of 2 who explained, Mama is learning many things in Italy that our Ukraine will also have to learn to join Europe. He noted that his participation in Ukraine's pro-Europe Orange Revolution in 2004 and in the Euromaidan uprising in 2014 was influenced by his mother and the information that he was receiving from migrants abroad. So I'll say more about those 2 revolutions in a moment, but this, I think, makes us wonder then, when did the Russian-Ukrainian war start? And it did not start 3 weeks ago. It started 8 years ago with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, where Ilana said she was evacuated out of Ukraine as that conflict started to take place. So it came out of, this is when it starts in Crimea, and then the annexation of Crimea has earlier debates about whether Ukraine would grow closer to Europe or to Russia. So the immediate antecedents then were the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan uprising. And the Orange Revolution, where Ina's sons participated, began with a presidential election. And it's gonna sound a little bit like a telenovela now, okay? There were 2 leading presidential contenders, Viktor Yushchenko, who championed a pro-West platform, and then the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, who was backed by Vladimir Putin and Ukraine's incumbent president, Kuchma. So November elections in 2004, the results declared Yanukovych, the pro-Russia candidate, the winner. However, there was evidence of fraud that led to mass protests in Kiev's Independence Square, where orange-clad protesters wearing Yushchenko's campaign color were camped out. So a new round of voting was ordered in January 2005, and Yushchenko wins this time. So Yushchenko declared that the peaceful Orange Revolution showed the world a genuinely different Ukraine, a noble European nation, one that embraces democratic values. So Yushchenko declared that the peaceful Orange, so many were hopeful then that Ukraine would find stability in the subsequent Orange government, but the Orange coalition collapsed and Yanukovych comes back and wins the presidency in 2010. However, in 2014, Yanukovych refuses to sign an economic agreement with the EU, and decided to take money from Russia instead. And mass protests erupt in Kiev, known as Euromaidan. And you can see them holding the EU flag along with the Ukrainian flag. So the protesters ousted President Yanukovych in 2014. All right, so as I have mentioned, Russian elites continue to deny Ukrainian independence and instead argue that Ukraine is part of Russia. So in April 2008, Putin describes Ukraine as an artificial entity with lands given to it by Russia and calls the Ukraine a failed state that needs Russian oversight. Ukraine's former ambassador to the US responds by stating that Russia has orchestrated an ideological campaign against Ukraine in preparation of a future operation for the seizure of a territory of a sovereign state. And still, the West was so surprised when Putin rolled in and occupied Crimea, right? So Putin occupies the southern Ukrainian territory of Crimea literally just weeks after Yanukovych is ousted and fled to Russia. So fighting in the eastern provinces of Ukraine then has been ongoing for 8 years, and we haven't been paying attention. The Russian invasion of February 24th is just an escalation of a war that Europe and the US has largely been ignoring. And, I just want to point out that the occupation of Crimea, I mean, even those of us who are used to being ignored in Ukrainian studies thought like the world was going to do something about that, right? It's the first land grab in Europe since World War II. And I think most folks who study the region feel like we just let Putin have it. And I keep getting surprised. So, all right, I'm almost done. So the EU then has expanded to Ukraine's border. Ukraine, you can see by this map, is flanked by Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, all of which are already EU members. And Ukraine has been knocking on the EU's door and has not been let in. Okay, so the word Ukraine means borderland, and Europe and the West has been content to exclude Ukraine from EU membership and have it act as a buffer between Russia and the EU and NATO. So in 1991, as a newly independent country, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world. But in the years that followed, Ukraine made the decision to completely denuclearize because we asked them to. In exchange, the US, the UK, and Russia agreed that they would guarantee Ukraine's security in a 1994 agreement known as the Budapest Memorandum. So Ukraine's expectation was that the US and Great Britain would come to its aid should its borders be threatened, and they feel that that hasn't happened. So now the US and Europe are in a bind. Ukrainian President Zelensky just this morning asked the US Congress once again to close the skies above Ukraine. The Biden administration is saying, well, because Russia does have nuclear weapons, we don't want to do that because we're afraid that it might escalate into a larger war. The Ukrainian perspective is, yes, we know, and we had nuclear weapons too. We gave them up at your request, which was the right thing to do because it reduced the overall number of nuclear weapons in the world. That makes everyone safer, but it did make Ukraine more vulnerable to a Russian invasion. And there's, it's a complicated, I'm not going to say what's the right answer here because it is it's very complicated. But the feeling is on the Ukrainian side that the West is letting the world know that if you have nuclear weapons, then the West will be afraid to intervene, right? So again, it's just that Putin's crazy argument, I think, obscures the role that Europe and the US play in creating the conditions for this war. And I'm not assigning blame, but I do think that in our globalized world, those at the center of power are implicated in most things, just because that is how the global arena is structured. All right, and so, you know, what can we do? And we can, I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts. I think we should support Ilana and her team and Boston Aide for Ukraine. And I think that we can talk about TPS, which was just granted, but has not yet opened up for Ukrainians. And the thought is that offering TPS, which is temporary protective status, that would allow folks on temporary visas from Ukraine who arrived here before March 1st to stay in the US and be able to work for the next 18 months. So we can think about how we support folks on TPS, how we support refugees, and of course, right now, I think we need to really harass our representatives about trying to convince the Biden administration to welcome more Ukrainian refugees. So right now, 3 million Ukrainians have fled the country already, according to UN data. Poland is currently the largest receiving site of Ukrainians, and they are struggling and asking for support, which is why it's so great that Ilana's group is able to get supplies right to Poland. Ukrainians are seeking refuge in Romania, in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Moldova. Moldova has the largest per capita number of refugees, and it is the poorest country in Europe. So, you know, I think the US might need to step up. So far, we've admitted a couple hundred Ukrainian migrants. And so there's a letter right now written by 36 Democratic lawmakers urging Biden to increase refugee admission and allow Ukrainians with family in the US to reunite them here, and some other strategies. So anyway, I think that one of the things about our democracy is you'd be surprised at how much emailing and calling, picking up the phone and calling our representatives does matter. So, all right, that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for being patient.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. That was comprehensive, complex, and it gives us a lot to think about. Are you seeing two pictures, one frozen of me and one not frozen? No.
I'm just
okay.
seeing
I'm seeing, I don't know why I'm seeing two pictures, so that's weird. Okay, so do folks, I mean, I encourage people to put their questions into the chat or comments that you want to, have Cinzia address. It's just, a resident of India and a sort of a citizen of the global South. I just want to point out that the refugee issue is something we've grappled with many, many times. The majority of Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh. Afghani refugees are in Pakistan. The Turks got the Syrian refugees. The Jordanians got the Palestinian refugees. And the US has never, right, stepped up to the point, that is proportionate to its intervention in global affairs. So that's just a long-standing, I think, fact of geopolitical geopolitics. Okay, I do see a question. Let's see. Okay, so Will asks, you mentioned EU membership as a point of contention, but the Minsk Accord doesn't reference the EU, it references only NATO. So could you comment on the role of NATO membership and the Minsk Accord?
Sure, so what to say about NATO? So
yeah,
here, I'll show you. Oh, did I get rid of that picture? I had a picture of the NATO map and just seeing how NATO has been sort of moving eastward. And, I feel like there's always like dueling perspectives, and one feeling is that if Russia decided it was going to include Canada in a military alliance, we would not be happy about that, and we would maybe feel threatened by that. And on the other hand, there is a lot of small European countries with a long history of sort of imperial domination. And so what does one do? So, I think it's just, I think the issue is, do we feel okay sacrificing Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine has really sort of been our sacrificial lamb. Like, we just, in order to keep this really precarious system balanced, we're gonna let Ukraine absorb the heat from both sides. And so I think it's it's a complicated negotiation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see. I mean, I think there's been a back and forth on the chat about, specifically Facebook changing its hate speech policy. And I think someone clarified to allow so-called hate speech or speech that's targeted to Russian soldiers. And I think I want to just zoom out from that discussion. And you commented on it as well. Mm-hmm. So, on the one hand, many folks in the US and Europe, including many of us here, see ourselves as sort of, supporting some form of liberal democracy in this particular kind of moment. And at the same time, we see these strains of illiberalism in our response, right here in the United States. And I think that's what folks in the chat are also grappling with. Once you made the comments about the harassment of those who call themselves Russian, as an economist, I see sanctions also as not having a great track record of success, particularly since they tend to target ordinary people rather than elites, and so being very blunt instruments. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I know you made an appeal to all of us, and I'm just wondering about your broader thoughts on, how you navigate this boundary between expressions of solidarity and expressions of hostility, right? Where sometimes when you try to express solidarity to someone, you end up feeling like you must express hostility to somebody else. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that boundary and how porous it is.
Yeah. So I guess, I would say I'm watching. So I'm a member of the American Association of Ukrainian Studies, right? And so I'm just looking at the emails that are going, our listserv is, as you can imagine, is like crazy. And one of the things that they're grappling with is, should we be banning individual Russian scholars from our conferences or not? It's, it's interesting. And, on the one of our area organizations has come out and said, no, we're not like discriminating against people on the basis of nationality. That is not what we do. And then on the other hand, there's a feeling that, well, if you're not speaking out against, then you are for. And then the other side says, well, but if you speak out against in Putin's Russia, you could end up in jail. And how courageous do we expect people to be in order to attend our conference? Sure. So I had a conversation this weekend with a colleague whose family lives in Russia. And she said that her family is afraid to say anything about the conflict on the phone, that whether it's true or not, their feeling is that their phones are tapped and that it could get them in trouble. So I think right now, it's just, unless somebody is like directly funneling money, I mean, that they are directly funneling money. I think especially in our US context, it just makes sense to assume, unless given evidence to the contrary that, folks are thinking about looking at those images and feeling similar senses of horror around it. And, I think that if you are from Russia right now, it's also really painful because you didn't do this. You didn't want this. You probably, lots of folks in Russia everybody has a cousin in Ukraine, right? And so I just think that, if we're going to err, or we should err on the side of assuming that everyone is looking at these images and feeling heartsick about it.
Yeah. I'm an Indian citizen, and I don't always agree with the actions of my government. so it does feel like something that we all need to think about in terms of our positioning here. Let me see.
I have an Italian passport and survived Berlusconi, so.
Right. So. Yeah. Let me just see. Are there other questions in the chat? Folks are thanking you for a helpful and interesting presentation. Maybe I have so many. I want to go back to the issue of gendering nationalism, which, I'm just interested in, gendered political economy. And so you discussed how the sort of the building of the new Ukraine is this sort of gendered process, and these grandmothers who are working in Italy and elsewhere are kind of teaching their children how to be capitalist subjects and how to be European and building the new Ukraine. So I don't know if you've heard from any of them, or I'm not sure. But again, the narratives of resistance in war, again, you tend to see the men fight, and in some cases, women, of course, in the Ukrainian case. But there tends to be, I'm wondering if there's something you feel we should know about maybe invisible ways, less visible ways in which the Ukrainian resistance is gendered, or, how these same women might be contributing to it.
Yeah. So, there's a bunch of writing on Euromaidan. So there's a movie called Winter on Fire. It's a documentary film that documents the protests in Kiev during Euromaidan. And this is not my research, this is colleagues' research, were on the square, sort of seeing women's bodies on the square, talking to women who had organized into women's militias. And a part of the discourse that emerged on the square is that the men were doing this to protect the woman, and the women were sort of, eventually pushed off the square for their own good. And they instead worked, cooking and supplying food to everyone, making sure everyone had clothes. And it's a very interesting, dynamic, because that film, which in the film, you can see the women's bodies on the square, but the narrative, they get written out completely and aren't part of the story. And the film follows like a 13-year-old boy, no, a 12-year-old boy. And the narrative is like, he's coming into manhood by being on the square, and that he's able to choose this for himself, but the grown women aren't. Right. So it's very interesting, right? That, that kind of work gets, it becomes invisible. So I'm not sure what the story will be that will be uncovered about the kind of work that women are doing now in Ukraine. But I can tell you they're working.
Right. And we see Ilana as an example of that, but, in Ukraine also there must be, yes. I can imagine. Let me see, any other comments or questions? Not yet. Let me see what the time is. Again, I still have more questions if no one else. Okay, I'll make this the last question. I'm sure folks need to leave and you need to leave. But is there anything that has surprised you about what has unfolded over the last 3 weeks?
Is there anything that has surprised me? Well, I guess is there anything that has surprised me? I guess I'm surprised by the welcome that Ukrainian refugees have gotten in the neighboring countries, and Poland in particular has been unbelievable. I mean, images of women leaving baby strollers in front of trains filled with refugees coming into the station so that women getting off of trains have a stroller to put their children in. I mean, it really is some just really amazing stories of folks pulling together. So I don't know that I was expecting quite that amount of outpouring. And I guess I am also surprised that the West is paying attention, because I think the part of the fallout of the Cold War is that the narrative in the US is we won, they lost. And so it's not a region of the world that we spend much time thinking about. It's sort of vanquished. And really, the world we have today was constructed in opposition to the former Soviet Union and in dialogue with the former Soviet Union. So I'm hoping that one of the things that comes out of this is that we recover some of that history, because it will make us more intelligible to ourselves. Why do we do things this way? It will help us explain some of those things. Yeah.
Well, I did say last question, but now there are 2 more questions. I don't know if the organizers want to tell me if we need to wrap up. Otherwise, I will read out those questions. And one of them is to, again, do with the theme of anti-Semitism that Ilana had mentioned. And I think Ellen would like you to talk about, are there right-wing neo-Nazi anti-Semitic elements within Ukrainian nationalism?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she has a longer question, but that's certainly Putin's framing. But setting aside Putin's framing, what is that strand important in Ukrainian nationalism?
Yeah, so, I think that idea comes out of World War II. So during World War II, Ukraine made another attempt to create an independent state. And it had the Russians coming on one side and the Germans on the other, and they made a deal with the Germans against the Russians, right? And so that's where this stereotype of Ukrainians as being Nazis, I think, comes from. And, is there anti-Semitism in Ukraine? Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we have swastikas also drawn on our high school bathrooms at once a year, it seems like. So unfortunately, I think that is still, a strand that's alive and well. I think Putin is doing something pretty interesting, which is, I talked about claims making, how do you make claims to being a modern nation? And that's a legitimating strategy that, we compete really in sort of an arena of modernity for status. And, part of that has to do with how do you treat your marginalized people, your women in particular, and also your other minority groups. And so he's making a claim to modernity by saying, I'm protecting Jewish people through this invasion, right? That's his attempt. I don't think it's taken hold.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's one very specific question, which is from Bob, who says, can you explain something about the Holodomor famine? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And explain how that fits into the Russian-Ukrainian dynamic.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, okay.
Yep. So the Holodomor was under Stalin. It was a manufactured famine that Ukrainians think of as a genocide, and it is it's mobilized in different ways depending, on the context. So I think in the Ukrainian context, given the war right now, you'll hear Ukrainians talk about this is a genocide, and it comes from because that is a discursive tool in Ukrainians' history's toolkit. So it bears on this moment because that word genocide will come up. In the context of San Francisco, when I was doing research, was this interesting thing where the different generations had a different relationship to that history. So the folks, who are maybe second or third generation Ukrainian in the Ukrainian Greek churches, the priests would sort of set up Ukrainian identity around sort of this historical event, and there's lots of organizing around the Great Famine, and for them, Ukrainian identity was tied closely with the Great Famine, and they were very surprised that their recent immigrants, right, sort of looked at them and were like, who cares about hungry people all those years ago? We're hungry now, right? And so it's this interesting, and so then just within our immigrant community, there are lines around who's authentically Ukrainian and who's Soviet, not really Ukrainian. So, it was a different terrain of claims making around who gets to claim Ukrainian authenticity. So, you've never been to Ukraine, you don't speak Ukraine because your generation's out, but you've got this strong identity around the Great Famine compared to somebody who's like, I lived in Ukraine up until last week, and you're telling me I'm Soviet. so
Right.
Interesting negotiations.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think we are probably out of time. I see that someone has put some resources into the chat for folks to look at. I want to thank you so much, Chinzia. And, of course, thank you to Ilana, who spoke earlier. And thank you to everybody who joined and participated and asked questions. Maybe, we'll maybe a year from now, we will all meet again and, discuss how this is how it's all emerging. But I'm going to hand it back to maybe Amy or Jenna, whoever wants to kind of close out the event. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank Chinzia and Smriti. It has just been a wonderful evening, and I feel like I've learned I feel like I couldn't ask a question because there was so much to absorb, and I think it's just been so helpful to have a better understanding. And I just was kind of blown away by some of the history that you mentioned, and it's really been, as you say, it's been a long time coming, and we just didn't know. And so this has certainly given us a much greater background. And so we just thank you for sharing your expertise, and so appreciate Ilana giving her perspective and her family's history. And, she's doing wonderful work with this aid for Ukrainian. I'm not saying that correct, but Boston's Aide.
Boston Aide.
Yes. And it's so important that we reach out. And so I thank everybody. And it is on behalf of the Lane Lyceum and First Parish, I just want to thank everybody. I'm so pleased to see so many people coming to this. Jenna, do you want to end with a couple words?
I didn't have anything planned, but I could just add my thanks to all of our presenters and for you all for being so active in the chat, and for your ongoing, there's scholarship and there's also witness, and we're just so grateful for all of it. And so I can extinguish our chalice with our typical chalice extinguishing words at First Parish. Let's see if I can do it like this, which is, and I assume that after we extinguish our flame, we'll probably log off after that. So thank you all so much for such a wonderful evening. So we extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we gather again. Thank you all, and have such a peaceful, blessed rest of your evening.